Welcome to B&W Insights. I'm your host, Mark Seifert, and on today's episode, we talk planning, comprehensive plans, urban-rural planning, all about growth. From our Houston office, we have Cristin Emshoff, and I'm excited. Let's get ready. Cristin, thank you so much for coming down to the podcast today. How was the flight?
Pretty bad.
That's usually not the answer, but with the weather that we've been having, I will take that. I'm excited for today's interview, first off, because in talking to you this past week, you truly have to know about so many different parts of government and municipal government. And I just want to start off with a general question. What is planning and what are comprehensive plans?
Yeah, so planning is actually a high-profile version of looking at kind of like, the bird's eye view down on a city and making a lot of recommendations in different categories. The goal is to bring the community together. The goal is to sort of like look behind the curtains and, look at areas of transportation. And we look at, areas such as utilities, infrastructure, and land use to figure out how they all work together. And then we work with the community to, identify those goals. So do they want to grow? Do they want to shrink? Are they trying to grow different corridors or shift, land uses to different sides of town? And so we essentially work with all of those parameters and come up with, an implementation strategy that works for each city.
So I assume what you're talking about there is a comprehensive plan, and a comprehensive plan brings everything together. I really like what you said. You work with all the different departments. And someone who worked in government for many years, sometimes municipalities, they don't work together department by department. How do you and your team really bring those departments together?
So that is one of the things I love about planning. We're always kind of in the middle of the politics. We're always in the middle of sort of conflict, and it's about sort of coming in and identifying the problems,
right,
but also to identify solutions so that we can bring others together. One of the ways that we do that is we definitely have a lot of engagement strategies that we actually do with the community and with the department heads themselves. So we'll meet with the department heads, get their, specific things that are a challenge to them. We'll meet with the community to see if they're the same things, and then we'll try to tie it into the plan. And then essentially when the plan is completed, it becomes part of the budget process. So every city needs a comprehensive plan. They need to be identified, and they sort of set the framework for the budget every year. Mm-hmm. And so most states say that they need to be updated, within 10 years, but we usually think about 5 makes sense unless you're starting to have a lot of controversy in the communities.
All right.
So when you see the public coming in and you've got a lot of, tumultuous things going on at City Hall, that's the kind of stuff that, if your village is, having these meetings where it's a lot of a crew showing up, that is probably when you need to, be looking at that and making sure that your goals and priorities are correct.
All right.
Because department heads serve the community.
Right.
So if we don't know what those strategies of the community are, and then we also don't know what our politicians are looking for, it's pretty hard to deliver a product that makes sense.
You got to make sure everybody's goals align. They're all pushing towards that same goal.
Mm-hmm.
Now, your background, you did work for municipalities.
I did.
How does having that insider knowledge and, you were day-to-day at a municipality, now working on the consulting side, how did that transition help you to what you're doing today?
So yes, I did. I did actually work in municipalities. I don't think I ever fully knew that I wanted to be a planner.
Okay.
It wasn't something that I just kind of knew about. But I actually started, when I went to school, I actually wanted to be a horticulture major. Right.
Wow,
So
that's a turn.
It's pretty random,
yeah,
kind of. But it kind of led me into not knowing what I wanted to do after, sort of outside of, after getting a job and things. And so after I figured out, what I wanted to do, I actually went to one of my professors at school and asked him, hey, what does this sort of look like? And he mentioned to me GIS. And so it's all about putting the pieces together. Mm-hmm. And so from that, I just kind of kept meeting these different groups that were all about putting the pieces together. And so I realized, I really enjoy this, And so one of my first jobs was actually with a city that I worked with that I actually went to college. And they introduced me to the planning department.
Okay.
And so it was like, oh, wow, I think this is really what I want to do. And so I just kind of kept going that way. And then I ended up in municipal government, not necessarily a path that I knew I was going to end up in. But I think one thing that you do find is a lot of competing interests, if you will, because at the end of the day, public service is looking for infrastructure, right? They're trying to deliver an infrastructure product, right?
Right.
You've got the development services group, who's usually just has a lot of controversial, issues coming their way. They're trying to get variances approved or zoning issues, coming through, or just building permits and things. And then when you add the police and fire, they're saving lives.
Right.
So how do you get those groups on the same page? And I think really just kind of being an insider perspective and working through the different issues and different, getting to know the different departments and what our main functions are helped. And I think that also kind of those really basics of city government come into each of the plans that we have.
Right.
So I think that I don't know, insider perspective, if you will, was helpful.
Well, and that's good because, I think today in this interview, we're going to talk about a lot about the word growth. And I think every community and municipality has a different definition of growth. And I really want to know is how do you, when you walk into a community on the first day, you get your comprehensive plan proposal signed and you walk in there, what's your way to find out what that municipality's definition of growth is?
Yeah. Well, we actually start with an existing conditions analysis. So we'll come in and we'll look at demographics, right? Because a lot of times what happens with communities is that there's either misinformation or we just don't know. And so there's sort of this rhetoric that's like circling City Hall or circling in the community that we have to somewhat change. And so we start with the data. So we pull the data forward and we're going to look at, who's moving in, what age groups are important. Do we have an ethnic population? Are we interested in culture? So we're basically going to, do all that analysis and look at the numbers. And then we're going to come back to the community and definitely let them know this is what we're finding. And then, talk about trends on what kind of things are happening with, say, the last 10 years. And then sort of ask their question about growth. What do you think growth is? I would ask someone kind of the same question about your measure of success. What is your measure of success with growth? Right. So what do you think is good or bad? Do you want to be bigger? Do you want to be smaller? And it's not for us to tell a community what to do. It's better for us to ask them what they want to do and then make that happen for them. Mm-hmm. So we always start with data and bring it forward and then let the community react to that.
Oh, I think it's so cool. Personally, I had no idea the comprehensive plans start with data and they're data driven. That data drives the conversation to start. And you said it best in our phone call the other day is you're a neutral party. You're coming in there and saying, what do you want and how can we make that happen, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, planners, especially when you get your certification, which is an AICP, it is all about serving the public interest. I'm not about, we have to basically listen to the grounds, to build up. And so we don't do the top down kind of forceful. It's not what planners are charged. We're charged for listening and to really kind of hearing the details and figuring out how we can turn that into a better product. So it's not my goal to come in and tell someone what to do. It's my goal to come in and listen and then ask them, is this what I heard from you? Is this what you really want? And then to build that out for each community, because not everybody wants the same thing, Right. Some places want to be urban. Some people want to be, very rural. Maybe a place wants to stay, a village. It depends. So it isn't for me to decide.
And I especially think, especially down in Texas where you are, but in many parts of this country, the migration of people is massive in the last 5 years. People are moving to Texas especially, and a lot of these communities have a very important choice to make about what is their community going to look like in the next 5 to 10 years. Do they want to accept growth, or do they want that rural feel that they currently have? And I'm sure that's a difficult conversation for you to have sometimes.
It is, and I would actually say one of the biggest challenges with the amount of boom we are having is the fact that we can't necessarily keep up with the infrastructure. Mm-hmm. So when you look at the age of these communities, a lot of them in Texas were really built, kind of like the mid, where they really got to operate more around like the 1950s. Mm-hmm. And so when you look at our infrastructure side, we're, 70, 80 years old.
Right.
And so we're starting to age out, but then we're also trying to add new lines in and things.
So you're trying to replace and fix the old while installing new, so you're almost getting hit double.
Yeah, we are, and then it's also different. So you might have a central fabric in a city that's definitely the main street roads and the beautiful courthouse, and all kinds. It sort of looks and feels a certain way, and then you get development outside of it that looks and feels a different way. And so, how to react to that? A lot of times, what we see is people don't react to it very well, and then it's also, can the city afford it? Are we making the right decisions with our taxpayer dollars? And so there's always a conflict with that. And usually what's interesting though is people usually come back to a couple of foundations that they both agree in, even when the sides are both on the other side of the table. But it's very much about infrastructure. And so we often look at water, wastewater services when we are, building out our plans to make sure we can build with capacity.
And I'm sure a little bit is the transition from that, the courthouse with the main street to the more contemporary looks of strip malls and restaurants and standalone businesses. And how do you go from that transition of that Main Street USA feel to suburban USA feel? And how does that, is there a transition zone or how do you work through that?
Sometimes it happens on its own and happens pretty bad, right? And so sometimes you have to sort of like go back and reformulate. One of the challenges that we have in Texas right now, actually, is that it's a little different than Illinois in that we can't annex anymore like we used to be able to in the areas outside the city limits. So what it means is if you have a development outside a city, you have to actually ask them to volunteer to come in. And so there's actually a lot of negotiation that happens. Because at the end of the day, community wants to have have your sales tax dollars, right? And also of course, provide water and sanitary service. And so there's a bit of a negotiation now. And then we also can't do look and feel anymore. And so we can't actually come in and look at materials and things. And that used to be one of the best ways to make community sort of feel the same way is that you would have standards for stone or for different types of brick and things like that. We can't do that in Texas anymore.
Wow.
And so it makes it incredibly difficult. So the legislator is definitely turning sort of away from government when it comes to, this conversation and really going to more of the private side. And it's actually leading to a lot more leapfrog development, which is, of course, more costly. So that's one of the questions we ask is, okay, so if we'll take people through growth scenarios and say, okay, growth scenario number one, let's look at this, downtown area. We love it. It's beautiful. Great. Do we want to grow this thing, right? And then maybe scenario two, we'll look at the areas outside the city limits. Hey, are we more interested in that? What does that look like? And we'll, sort of poll the group and ask, what are the things that make sense? And then we'll walk through those infrastructure questions and say, do we want to do bond programs and things for development to happen? And maybe that's the answer. But we try to be strategic on where that can go. And comprehensive plans are very much part of that conversation, especially when you turn it into zoning.
Right.
So when one of the best ways for us now to sort of like tie the two together or to make sure that, of course, you have the comprehensive plan, the zoning, and then it at least can lay, the framework for where like building placement and size and height and things like that can
now,
be.
To go back just a couple minutes, leapfrog development, term I've never heard. I'm sure some of our listeners have never heard as well. Can you give us an explanation?
Definitely. So in Houston, I'm sure most people know sprawl, right? That's what we're known for. We're known for being, you go to the downtown area. It's probably similar to Chicago, right? We have buildings all over the place. It's very grand. It's huge, right? Like you feel the scale that's like, oh, wow. You look up, you definitely have to, you're looking at the sky, right?
Right.
Leapfrog development definitely created sort of the concept that we don't want this. We don't want this high-rise sort of environment where we're living in our communities where our single-family homes are, right? And so what people did is it was the whole movement where, you put a single-family home, subdivision outside building subdivisions.
Okay.
But you're separating away from that. So you've created this sort of like environment of the city core, and then there's a subdivision over here, and there's a subdivision over here, and a subdivision all over town, right? All they're different.
Right.
But they don't connect. They don't necessarily make a whole lot of sense on like placement.
All right.
And they're pretty random. A lot of times they are all about the price of the property and then really access to whatever, to water or sanitary, or maybe they like the creek that ran through there. But there's not a lot of planning that went into it. And so when you end up a leapfrog development like that, you definitely have to run, a lot more utilities out there, and it can get very expensive for places. And so that leapfrog development is definitely what Houston is known for.
All right.
And it's something that us planners want to ask the question, do you want to do this? And there's a cost for that. There's a cost for decisions of that sort.
Are there any trends that you see moving forward in terms of development or?
In terms of?
Types of development, whether it be this getting away from leapfrog development, or are we just seeing massive growth everywhere that we're trying to keep up with?
So I would say one of the real big challenges of the legislator is that things are getting even more random. So in places that we used to develop before we had zoning rules, you would have a very set like criteria that would come through, and you kind of knew generally what would come through. The goal isn't to necessarily have the same product, but it's sort of to have the same sort of like form and function, if you will. So if you're going to have a single family home, it's generally this size. If you're going to have retail commercial, it's generally this size. And it's based off of course, the number of trucks and things you can handle, right? So if we build like shopping centers, we don't want to, build these tiny roads that are built for maybe a bike, right? So you want to make sure they're wide enough. We've actually seen a lot more kind of randomness coming through where there isn't really a lot of framework. And there's also been a focus lately on, senior services, if you will, senior aging populations. I don't remember the latest census report, but I do know that at some point by 2035, the senior citizen population was going to be around 35%.
Wow.
And when you look at how much that is for how much the baby boomers are going to be entering into that by like 2045, I think it doubles.
Wow.
And so there's quite a bit of interest. And when you look at aging populations, one of the things that's very important is that you want to make sure that you're putting senior citizens near like places where like children are and families, right? Makes sense. And so we try to look for that. We try to look for parks and open spaces and things that are kind of connected to that. And it's also looking at things like maybe your own house, right? So maybe you want to add on a garage apartment, or you want to do something like that where, I don't know, you're putting, you want to be closer to grandma. And so you sort of find a way to, build a dwelling or something on your property. Those are definitely the kind of things that, people are looking at. And I would say on the retail commercial side, something that a lot of people are looking at too are reuse. So something that's definitely going away right now are malls. So in some places of the world, they're actually looking at, coming in and building walls and things to have like living structures inside, which I think is fantastic. I would love to do that myself. But basically the idea is that you can shop in all the things that you do in a mixed use development where you have the restaurants and, retail and, the single family residential or multifamily all in one place. But it's right within walkable distance and inside. I mean, who doesn't want that?
That's everything you need in one spot.
Yeah. So it's kind of an interesting use of a property that could otherwise just sit there and, have no use for the community. And so I think it's a good trend that we're seeing.
So in Northern Illinois, we see this especially, I'm sure this is seen all over the country, is there's communities that are just landlocked. And you touched on this a little bit at the beginning, but how does a community that's landlocked need a comprehensive plan and understand that they can grow in other ways? They can grow their tax base or they can grow their population. When does a landlocked city kind of need to know they need a comprehensive plan, and what are some of those things that they could look at?
Definitely. Some of my favorite landlocked cities are often ones that sometimes think that they only need residential. They only need, single family. Maybe they're not interested in multifamily or really anything else, right? What I've found with those communities, what's interesting is I think there is sometimes a misconception that, or maybe not an understanding that when you do have different tax bases, it actually offsets your tax rate, right? So when you have, I don't know, the McDonald's corridor, or you have like a place where there's actually, whether it's drive-through businesses or it's actually shopping centers, that whatever money is spent in that place is going to, essentially possibly lower your tax bill. And it also means that sometimes the communities too, so that's one way to encourage, right? You could do development down like a corridor. But you can also bring in different housing types that also brings in different incomes.
Right.
So something that's kind of interesting is people that are usually 30 years and younger are super interested right now. They're not getting married, right? But they're very interested in eating out, and they're very interested in like buying properties that are more of a townhome, more of a multifamily, unit, possibly living with like a friend. Or they want to live in these mixed-use developments. And so when we say no to those, we're usually saying no to people that are going to spend money in our town. And so that's something to kind of be aware of is, the different ways that people live.
Right.
And usually that multifamily word is very scary for people. especially in an environment where I would say affordability is definitely kind of out the window for some places, and you can no longer attain a house. And so what we've actually been looking at is more of attainable housing for, people that are more like, say our cops, our firefighters, our teachers. Do we really want to say no to these groups? No. So those are kind of the concepts to look at when you're landlocked. You get to get more particular, but you need to know why you're making the decision that you're at. And that decision can lead to sales tax, or it could lead to, different people moving into the community.
To wrap up, my final question, it's almost a point as well, is it seems like planning is a lot like sociology, and it's the study of people and their movements and what they want to do. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely is. Not the psychological side, but there is a lot of data that goes into it, and is definitely about when we say building a sense of community or even placemaking, we want the place to be very memorable for that, for whoever we're serving. And so, one of the things that we also want to do is go in and, try to understand if there's like a culture, right? You want to understand, Houston specifically is one of the most, ethnically diverse places, right, in America. And I love that because you get all these different people that come in, and I love just seeing what I got, right? Like, how is that different than what I was, what I grew up as? And a lot of times what you learn from these cultures is just things that you didn't know about. So I think it is studying that.
It's studying people. It's learning what they like to do. And well, I want to thank you for coming into the podcast studio today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah. So far, our entire team here at Baxter and Woodman, if you liked what you heard today, subscribe, follow, share our podcast. Come back every first Tuesday of the month so you don't miss an insight. Have a great day.